So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Arleen Tuchman. And Professor Tuchman is the Nelson O. Tyrone Jr. Chair in History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, just a few hours away from me. And her latest book is on the book table outside, called Diabetes, History of Race and Disease, published by Yale in 2020. And Dr. Tuchman specializes in a variety of history, medicine, culture, and this is her third book, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her. So thank you for your patience, and thank you for joining us on Zoom.
So let me begin by thanking Dr. Carol Saka for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to thank Dr. John Dirks for following up and staying in touch with me. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk about research that I've conducted over, really, to be honest, the past 20 years, and which has recently culminated in a book on the history of diabetes and race. I just want to say that this is not a story about insulin. I cleared it with the organizers, and they said this is just fine. So let me share my screen. So I first became interested in this topic shortly after my father moved to Nashville in 2002. He'd been diagnosed with diabetes in 1985 when he was 65 years old. The doctors assumed he had type 2, and this made sense. He was 5'3" when he stood up really tall. He weighed about 150 pounds, and he was in his mid-60s. So it all seemed to fit a diagnosis of type 2. But it turns out that his physician was wrong. Not until my parents moved to Florida a year and a half later did an endocrinologist realize that my dad had latent autoimmune diabetes of adults. And by that time, he weighed just 118 pounds. Well, not until my dad moved to Nashville 17 years later did I really start to understand what it meant to have a family member living with this disease. And I became intrigued, wanted to know more about the history of diabetes. And so I began looking around to see what was available about the history of the disease. And I learned quickly that most of what was written focused on type 1. And I started wondering, what would it mean to be more focused on type 2? I later realized that that was anachronistic, since the types were not really distinguished until the 1970s, even though physicians were aware that it mattered the age at which someone developed the disease. But what really intrigued me was when I learned that about 100 years ago, diabetes mellitus had been considered a Jewish disease, which was clearly different than what I was reading about the racial groups that were most at risk of developing diabetes. That is what I was reading in the early 2000s. And those populations were largely Native Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And so that kind of contrast is what hooked me as a historian. So the central argument of my book, and the main point that I will be making today, is that there is a long history of using race and, to some extent, class to explain health disparities. And I want to emphasize that race in my book is not code for Black. So this is a list of the table of contents of my book. And you can see from the different chapters that at different times over the past century, the population thought to have the highest rate of diabetes kept changing. So my first chapter is about diabetes as a Jewish disease. The second chapter is about diabetes as being largely a middle-class white disease. My third chapter looks at the invisibility of diabetes in African-American communities in the first half of the 20th century. And then the chapters 4 and 5 are both post-World War II. I look first at the discovery of diabetes among Native peoples shortly after the war, and then the nationwide hunt is a reference to the search for diabetes in Native American, African American, and Hispanic, but largely Mexican American communities. The focus on race has meant that the dominant approach to explaining disparities was to blame biology and behaviors for high rates of the disease, which made it difficult to give more attention to structural inequalities and social determinants of health. That is, to really grapple with the role of racism and poverty in making people sick, and thus in producing differential disease rates. Now, there's a rich body of scholarship examining racial health disparities in diabetes today. What I contribute is a historical perspective, and with the belief that many of the problems that we are confronting today have their roots in the past. So before I dive into the body of my paper, I want to get one thing out of the way, and that is, I can't tell you whether diabetes rates for differential disease groups really changed over time. And that is because there's a real problem with statistics from the early 20th century, from the late 19th and early 20th century. So the statistics that claim to show that diabetes was prevalent among Jews more than among other populations was simply not reliable. And it was recognized at the time. So people were saying, you know, you're working with select populations. So there was recognition at the time. But what my book shows is that despite this awareness, racist assumptions became part of the explanations for why certain populations had higher rates of this disease. And so really what I have written is a cultural history. So where have racism and class prejudice shown up in diabetes past? So what I'm doing today is giving you a series of case studies. And my first is about Jews. And I'd like to take you back to the early 20th century, when the group considered most at risk of developing diabetes was white people in general, and Jews in particular, who were thought of as a separate race. Diabetes was also believed to be a disease of middle and upper class individuals. And it was believed that rates were lowest among Black people and Native Americans. And I just want to emphasize that this is what physicians and public health officials saw when they looked at the data. So, for example, so here's a quotation from the Canadian, William Osler, highly regarded clinician. I don't need to tell all of you this. The author of Principles and Practice of Medicine, which was the standard text in clinical medicine. This quotation is from 1892, where he stated in the section on diabetes that Hebrews seem especially prone to diabetes. For some reason, I mean, I'm happy to keep doing this, but it's like skipping a slide when I hit to go down. Elliot Joslin, perhaps the best known diabetes specialist in the country, wrote in 1916, the frequency with which diabetes occurs in the Jewish race is proverbial. And I also want to bring out that Jewish physicians agreed. Joseph Jacobs and Maurice Fishberg, the first an historian and folklorist, and the second a physician and physical anthropologist, wrote in an article on diabetes mellitus in the Jewish Encyclopedia, and this was published, it was a multi-volume work published between 1901 and 1906. They wrote, statistics prove conclusively that the disease occurs among Jews from 2 to 6 times as frequently as it does among non-Jews. So this was widely believed, but how did they explain the disparities? So let me remind you, as I said before, that diabetes was believed to be a single disease, and it was also widely believed to be a nervous disease, that is, a disease of the nervous system. And central to explaining disparities was scientific racism, the idea that distinct races existed, that they differed biologically, and that they could be ranked from the least to the most evolved. Now, the most common way to demonstrate this was to measure skulls, the most common way in the 19th century. And invariably, studies always showed that white people had the largest skulls and Black people had the smallest. But another very important marker of a race's place on the evolutionary ladder was the development of the nervous system. So, why did diabetes afflict white people and especially Jews more than Black people and Native Americans? The dominant explanation was that it was because their nervous system was more advanced. It's what made them more intelligent. It's what made them more civilized. It was also what made them more susceptible to diseases that afflicted the nervous system. Why were rates low among Black and Native peoples? It was argued that it was because their nervous system was dull, undeveloped, and insensitive. So here's a quotation from Emil Kleen, a Swedish physician whose translated work on diabetes circulated widely in the United States in 1900. Among all people beyond the pale of culture, diabetes is very rare. This, I believe, to be the correct way of viewing immunity among Africans, and the reason why so little is heard of diabetes among the Indians of America. With greater intellectual exertion, keener emotions, higher nervous development, more earnest struggle of existence, more urgent demands, a more intense culture, in fine, we are bound to find more diabetes mellitus. And one more, this is from Isaac Ivan Lemann, a physician who practiced in New Orleans and who conducted medical research on diabetes patients. And he wrote this in 1920. Nervous strain, intense application to business, mental shock and worry have frequently seemed to play an important role in precipitating the phenomena of the disease, that is diabetes, or aggravating it. The Negro race is to a very great degree free from these influences. The mental and nervous makeup of the Negro is in marked contrast to that of the Jews, among whom diabetes is disproportionately frequent. So diabetes was a marker of civilization. It was also tied to wealth, which was itself believed to be a marker of civilization. According to William Osler, it was a disease of the higher classes. Now, this positive image, if we can call it that, of diabetes did not prevent some physicians from using high rates of the disease among Jews to support anti-Semitism. One physician who worked for the United States Public Health Service labeled Jews a highly inbred and psychopathically inclined race. He blamed high rates of diabetes on some hereditary defect, and he believed that it was exacerbated by the practice of inbreeding. Others attributed diabetes to the Jews' neurotic temperament, and yet others blamed it on their racial tendency to corpulence. What I want to emphasize here is that there was a spectrum of meanings to choose from. Jewish physicians accepted that diabetes was prevalent in their communities, as I just showed, and they even accepted that it had something to do with biology and with their race, but they rejected the idea that it was a hereditary defect. Instead, they blamed high rates on millennia of anti-Semitism, and they argued that the anti-Semitism had rendered their nervous system labile. So this is a quotation from Albert Epstein, a nephrologist at Mount Sinai Hospital, and it's from a speech that he gave to the National Conference of Jewish Charities in 1919. The conditions under which the Jews have lived for many centuries have been such as would shatter the most resistant nervous system. We know what baneful influences suffering and misfortune can exercise on the mental and physical being of man. The recent war affords many sad examples of that. How much more profound must that influence be on a people who, for many generations, year in and year out, from the cradle to the grave, have endured oppression, privation, and every possible mental distress. And one more quotation, again from the article by Jacobs and Fishberg, who give the high rates of positive spin by reading high rates of diabetes and other nervous diseases as a sign of being highly civilized. With the present knowledge of the pathogenesis of diabetes, the only reasonable explanation of the frequency of the disease among Jews is their extreme nervousness, the Jews being known as the most nervous of civilized peoples. So what are the consequences of reading diabetes through a racial lens? Well, first, we can see that only Jewish physicians took seriously the claim that anti-Semitism created conditions that drove up rates. Most others blamed it on hereditary defect or a love of good living. We can also see through this lens that diabetes was rendered invisible in other communities. So when evidence began to emerge in the 1930s that rates of diabetes were rising in Black communities, few people paid attention. And there were several reasons for this, but the one that interests me most is that the cultural script was too powerful, so that diabetes was literally not seen in these communities, where seen I'm defining as being a decision to make a concerted effort to address the problem and also to replicate this information in mainstream medical articles. And this would not really change until the 1980s, but by that time, another racial group had earned the label of being most at risk, and that group was Native Americans. So this is my second case study. For a number of reasons, American Indian reservations became sites of federally funded medical studies in the United States in the 1960s. And during these studies, it was discovered that several tribes had some of the highest rates of diabetes, not only in the United States, but actually in the world. But no one, and this is the main point I want to make here, no one viewed high rates any longer as a marker of civilization. On the contrary, the popular explanation, which was captured in the thrifty gene hypothesis, was that diabetes rates increased dramatically when primitive bodies were catapulted into the 20th century. The thrifty gene hypothesis was the brainchild of the physician and human geneticist James Neal. So James Neal began with the question, why is diabetes mellitus spreading throughout the globe? Why hadn't natural selection wiped it out? Now, Neal had done work on sickle cell, and he knew about the link to malaria. And he wondered if he could come up with a similar evolutionary story that could explain the selective advantage that might have kept a diabetic genotype in the gene pool. And he published his hypothesis in 1962. And this is what he wrote. Let's imagine early humans living through alternating periods of feast and famine. Those who could store fat efficiently would have had a competitive advantage because they could store food during times of feast and thereby survive famines. And that could have kept the gene, the diabetic genotype, in the gene pool. The problem arose, he argued, when people had food all the time, because being an efficient fat storer now became a liability. So Neil published this in 1962. And in that article, he said nothing about Native peoples. In fact, he didn't even mention them in that article. Instead, he was trying to understand the near universal distribution of diabetes. He was thinking about all the peoples in the world. He also never presented it as a fact. He always viewed it as a hypothesis. But others soon narrowed it to indigenous populations, locating a diabetes genotype in native bodies. The thrifty gene hypothesis, as it developed, was based on the assumption that native peoples were frozen in time genetically, still possessing the same genotype common among early humans. And this is actually also what James Neal believed. So this is from the opening statement that he gave at a conference on biomedical challenges presented by the American Indians. And he argued Native Americans provided, and I'm quoting, one of the last great resources for the study of primitive man, one of the last opportunities to attempt to fathom the nature of the forces to which man was responding during the course of human evolution. The explanation that emerged was that Native Americans were experiencing high rates of diabetes, mellitus, because their primitive bodies had been parachuted into the 20th century in the space of a few years and had had no time to adapt. This allegedly also was the explanation for why rates were comparatively low among people of European descent, because their genetic makeup had had time to adapt to a Western lifestyle. So let me just point out again that in this formulation, diabetes mellitus was no longer a marker of civilization, but of primitive bodies. The cultural script had been flipped on its head. Now, once again, this was not the only explanation. Native activists, like Jewish physicians, argued that high rates of diabetes stemmed from racism. In this case, white settler colonialism and the demise of traditional foodways. In the 1970s and 1980s, they issued withering critiques of the actions of so-called civilized whites. They argued diabetes had not been a problem until white settlers stole native lands. The Akamel Udam, also referred to as Pima, who live in Arizona and have some of the highest rates of diabetes in the world, trace the problem to the early 20th century when white people dammed and diverted the flow of the Gila River away from their reservations and to their own white communities. Before then, they argued, they had used the river to irrigate lands and to farm. As a result of the dam, they experienced mass starvation, which made them dependent on government rations. But the rations consisted of flour, lard, coffee, sugar, salt, tobacco, and salt pork. It was nothing like the squash and beans they had grown. And by the 1960s, trading posts had added calorie-dense junk foods and soda. So from their perspective, the main reasons for high rates were not thrifty genes or poor lifestyle choices, but new diets, economic disaster, and social stress. So in both of these first two cases, there were competing ways of explaining high rates. The dominant explanation focused on the bodies and behaviors of those who were sick, trafficking in racial and racist stereotypes. The other way of explaining high rates emphasized prejudice and discrimination. And I just want to point out the parallel between the way that Jews had blamed diabetes on anti-Semitism and nervousness, and the way Native activists emphasized white settler colonialism and stress. but that way of thinking about the problem had difficulty gaining traction. In the 1970s, it seemed as though it was possible that this second way of thinking about health disparities might gain more traction. As a combination of the civil rights movement, the war on poverty, and the later Black Power and Indian rights movements, there was much greater attention to the social determinants of health. They insisted that racial discrimination and poverty were making people sick. In the United States, this was the heyday of community health centers designed to empower people to understand the roots of their problems and to take charge of their lives and their health. But this momentum was crushed when Reagan came to power and brought with him an emphasis on small government and individual responsibility. Funding dried up and the narrative changed. So my last case study is not about a single population, but rather about how diabetes prevalence was imagined and seen in the 1980s. This is the story of the Heckler Report, a government commissioned study of health disparities that was published in 1985. It was the brainchild of Margaret Heckler, the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, and of Thomas Malone, the Deputy Director of the National Institutes of Health. And it came about because Heckler and Malone had noticed that while the health of Americans was improving, it was not improving equally, and they wanted to know how bad the health disparities were. So they established a task force on Black and minority health to gather information. Now, this task force did not they didn't do their own research. What they did was bring together a literature review. And to make their task doable, they just had 1 year. They chose the 6 health conditions that had the greatest health disparities, and diabetes was one of them. And they focused on 4 racial groups: Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Pacific Islanders. And they compared all of them to whites. The Heckler Report ran to 10 volumes and sent shockwaves through the nation. One outcome, a positive outcome, was the establishment of the Office of Minority Health in 1986. And its goal was to improve the health of racial and ethnic minority populations by eliminating health disparities. 1986, eliminating health disparities. Well, that obviously did not happen. And I argue that is in part because the study was flawed. The major flaw is that the study kept the emphasis on the bodies and behaviors of those who were sick. Social determinants of health were rendered, by and large, invisible in this study. They also had different explanations for each of the different racial groups. So in the section on Black Americans, they focused on behavior. In the section on Native Americans, they focused on genetics. In the section on Hispanic Americans, they focused on genetics, in large part because they were obsessed with the percent of Native American ancestry. And only in the section on Asian Americans did they talk about stress. The study also rendered high rates of diabetes invisible among poor whites. It took another 15 years or more for attention to be directed, for example, to high rates of diabetes in Appalachia. So it also really erased the importance of class. So the study drew important and needed attention to health disparities, but it also erased structural racism. So as a way of concluding, let me reiterate that the dominant paradigm, the dominant frame for explaining health disparities and diabetes rates has long been race, both genetic and behavioral. That preference is not because of data. History shows that data can be interpreted through different lenses. Instead of race, the focus could have been on racism. Instead of emphasizing poor lifestyle choices and behavior, The focus could have been on social determinants of health, which strongly affect the choices people are able to make. Are you getting my birds? Sorry. Well, they're not my birds. They're outside my window. Some have tried in the past to shift this focus, but they had difficulty gaining traction. So I'd like to leave my talk with the question of whether we may be at an inflection point today when things might change, opening up a door for a greater focus on structural determinants of health. The Black Lives Matter movement has made structural racism a part of our vocabulary. And COVID-19 has made evident once again the role of structural racism in creating health disparities. So are we poised for a change in how we address health disparities? And if so, what would it take? Thank you.